The battlefield was still silent. There were no explosions, no gunfire, no cries of attack echoed through the forests of northwestern Russia, and yet men were already dying. The air cut like a blade. Each breath burned his lungs from the inside, as if the soldier were swallowing ground glass. The vapor that escaped his mouth froze on his scarves, forming icy crusts around his face. Beards turned into stalactites, eyelashes stuck together. The thermometer read -30 degrees, 35 degrees, sometimes worse, but the number didn't tell the whole story. The wind pierced through the jackets, seeped into the seams, seeped into the boots. It wasn't just cold, it was a constant presence, like an invisible enemy that never rested. The German soldiers of the 16th Army were not yet fighting. They were trying to survive on the very air they breathed. Rifles pressed against the shoulder burned the skin like a branding iron, only in reverse, an icy fire. Anyone who removed their glove for a few seconds to clean the weapon wrist, leaving pieces of skin stuck to the metal, fingers would turn white, then purple, then dead. Many men only realized they had lost feeling when they could no longer bend their hand. Truck engines wouldn't start. The oil turned to a thick paste. Tanks that should have roared on the battlefield stood still, silent, useless, frozen steel monsters. Fuel wouldn't flow. Radiators cracked. Tires shattered like glass under the weight of the ice. The sound was the worst. The forest was silent. There were no birds, no running water, only the occasional crackling of trees in the extreme cold, like distant gunshots that made the soldiers instinctively cower. At night, the terror intensified. Men slept in holes dug in the snow, huddled together to share warmth. Some didn't wake. They seemed merely too tired, but their bodies were stiff in the morning. The cold had taken them silently, without battle, without glory, without warning. Doctors couldn't treat everything. Frostbitten feet had to be amputated afterward. The simple act of urinating far from shelter could mean death if someone got lost in the white blizzard that obscured all directions. And then came the snow. It didn't fall gently, it swallowed the world. It covered roads, buried supplies and hid trenches. A man could take 3 steps off the path and disappear up to his waist. Vehicles vanished as if the earth had swallowed them whole. The war hadn't even really started yet, and winter was already winning battles. The soldiers began to understand something terrible. They weren't just facing an army. They were entering a place where nature itself wanted them to die, and the worst was yet to come. The Soviet counterattack. After Moscow, while the Germans struggled to avoid freezing to death, something was stirring on the other side of the storm. Far away, near Moscow, the impossible had happened. The German advance had been halted. For the first time since the beginning of the war in the East, Hitler's war machine was not advancing. It was bleeding, tired and panting, and Stalin saw the opportunity. The Red Army, which months before had retreated in panic, now came like a dark wave emerging from the snow. Divisions newly arrived from Siberia, men accustomed to the brutal cold, advanced in white camouflage coats, skis on their feet, sleds pulling machine guns. They weren't fighting the winter, they used winter. For the Germans, this was a nightmare taking shape. From within the frozen fog, lone shots began to emerge. Patrols disappeared into the forests. Sentries were found dead, covered by a thin layer of snow, as if winter itself had pulled the trigger. Then came the real attacks. Soviet artillery began raining down on German positions that barely had any cover. Explosions sent columns of snow and frozen earth flying, mixing ice, wood, and pieces of men into the white air. The ground trembled, not like mud, but like stone being broken by force. The German soldiers, already exhausted, now had to fight. But how to fight? Machine guns jammed. Bolts jammed. Numb fingers couldn't reload quickly. Every movement was slow, heavy, and painful. The cold not only killed, it made each man weaker than normal. On the Soviet side, the offensive was brutal and constant. They attacked in waves, emerging from the trees, shouting, advancing even under fire. Many fell, but others came after, always more. The landscape turned into a silent, white hell, punctuated by explosions, and screams muffled by the snow. The worst part was that the Germans were beginning to realize something dangerous. They were no longer in control. The lines were stretched too far. Roads were almost non-existent. Units were separated by miles of forest and frozen swamp. Communications failed. Orders didn't arrive. And the Soviets knew it. They weren't just attacking head-on. They were infiltrating from the flanks, cutting off trails, taking small villages that served as connecting points. It was as if invisible hands were slowly closing in around the German army. Men in the trenches began to hear a word whispered with fear. Surrounded, it wasn't official yet. There was still hope. But the feeling was clear, like the cold that wouldn't leave the skin. Something enormous was moving, and they were right in the middle of it. Winter had opened the door. Now, the Red Army was entering, the German advance too deep. To understand the disaster that was unfolding, it is necessary to imagine the map. German forces had advanced so far, so quickly, in the preceding months, that their lines resembled an arm stretched too far, with muscles tearing from the inside. The 16th Army was spread across the region of Demyansk, a place that wasn't made for war. It was made for devouring men. Dense forests like walls, swamps that turned into endless mud in the summer, and in winter, white plains that hid holes, frozen rivers, and invisible death. There were no real roads, only frozen dirt tracks that disappeared under the snow. Supply trains took days to travel short distances. Sometimes they didn't arrive at all. The soldiers in the forward positions felt like they were at the end of the world. Small wooden villages served as support points, houses transformed into command posts, barns turned into infirmaries, wooden churches housing ammunition. But everything seemed too fragile in the face of that icy emptiness, and the space between the units. It was too big. In some areas, entire. Companies were isolated by miles of forest. If they were attacked, reinforcements wouldn't arrive quickly. If a line fell, it would leave a huge hole. The officers knew this. The maps clearly showed the danger: exposed flanks, thin lines, total dependence on a few supply routes. But there were clear orders: hold the position, advance when possible, not give ground. So they stayed. Even with the trucks breaking down, even with soldiers collapsing from exhaustion, even with winter sapping our strength every day. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Soviets watched. They saw that the German lines stretched taut like a rope about to snap. They knew they didn't need to crush the center. They just needed to cut the sides. And they began to move silently along the edges. German patrols noticed something strange: less frontal contact, more lateral movement. Sounds at night in the forests, ski tracks in the snow where they shouldn't be. Small forward positions simply stopped responding on the radio. But most soldiers didn't see the bigger picture. To them, it was just another day, freezing, digging trenches in rock-hard ground, trying to keep their weapons functioning. They didn't realize they were becoming increasingly alone. The routes by which food, ammunition, and hope arrived were being observed, marked, prepared to be cut off. The 16th Army wasn't just too far forward. She was hanging in the void, sustained by thin threads of logistics and luck. And winter had already shown that luck didn't last long there. The next phase would not be just combat. That would be closing the trap. And when it closed, there would be nowhere to run. The Soviet coup closes the trap. January 1942. The snow was still falling, thick and heavy, as if the sky were trying to bury the entire earth. But beneath that white blanket, a gigantic movement was underway. The Red Army attacked suddenly, not at just one point, but at several, like teeth biting at the same time. Soviet divisions advanced. Along the flanks of the German position at Demyansk, crossing frozen forests, rock-hard swamps, and trails that only they seemed able to use. They did not come in organized columns along the road. They came scattered, infiltrating, appearing where no one expected them. German outposts were the first to feel the effects. A sentry saw shadows among the trees. A shot, then several. Radio calling for help. Silence. When reinforcements arrived, they found only stiff bodies in the snow and tracks, leading into the woods. And then a road collapsed, then another one. Small villages that served as connecting points were taken in quick and brutal fighting. Soviet machine guns were positioned covering narrow paths. Artillery began to fall exactly where the trains passed. Supply trucks were destroyed, burning like torches in the endless white. Horses tumbled, their carcasses freezing in strange positions. Survivors tried to flee on foot. Many didn't get far. Reports began arriving at the German command. Enemy contact in the rear. Road blocked. We couldn't break through. At first, they thought they were just local attacks, but the map became increasingly clear and more terrifying. Soviet red lines were converging behind the German forces, like a pair of scissors closing. Then came the confirmation that it was colder than winter. Land links with the rest of the army had been severed. Nearly 95,000 German soldiers, infantry, artillery, support, and wounded were now within a circle of snow, forest, and enemies. The Demyansk Pocket, he had been born. Inside, the reaction was a mixture of denial and shock. Some officers still spoke of a temporary situation. They said it would be reopened soon. But the soldiers on the front line knew the truth before any official order. They heard gunshots coming from the wrong directions. They saw signal flares on the horizon where the Allies should have been. Patrols sent out into the field never returned. They were no longer defending a line. They were defending an island of men surrounded by a Soviet ocean, a white, icy, deadly ocean. And at that moment, the war changed completely for them. It was no longer about moving forward, not even about winning. It was about one thing only, surviving surrounded in an icy hell. The net closes in. The white hell begins. When the news had fully spread, silence fell over many German positions. It wasn't the silence of snow, it was the silence of understanding. They were prisoners. Around them, the Red Army formed a living ring of men, cannons, and machine guns. Every trail, every clearing, every makeshift road now had Soviet eyes watching. The Demyansk Pocket wasn't a straight line on the map. It was a rugged terrain of dense forests, ruined villages, and frozen swamps. Within it, almost 100,000 men, they tried to organize themselves, but the space was too small for so many people and such limited resources. Soon, problems began to crush everything. Vehicles that were still functional were hidden under nets and snow, so they wouldn't be seen from the air. Ammunition had to be rationed. Every shot now had weight. The soldiers dug positions in the frozen ground, striking the soil with shovels and pickaxes that pounded as if they were trying to break stone. The trenches were shallow, poorly protected. Shelters were holes covered with wood, snow, and what remained of doors torn from houses. And the snow didn't stop. It covered everything. Supply, crates, bodies, weapons left behind. Paths made in the morning disappeared by night. A man could stray a few meters and lose his way. The injured were the worst sight. Without adequate hospitals, many stayed in freezing barns, wrapped in blankets as stiff as boards. Blood that trickled from wounds froze on their clothes. Some begged not to sleep. They knew that if they closed their eyes, they might not wake up, and the enemy wouldn't let them rest. Soviet artillery bombarded positions regularly. It wasn't always a massive attack, but enough to remind them they were surrounded. Explosions raised clouds of snow mixed with dark earth and pieces of wood. Each impact seemed louder in the white silence. At night, stray gunshots echoed through the forest. Soviet patrols tested the defenses, attacked weak points, and vanished like ghosts. The fear grew slowly, like the cold seeping into the boots. The soldiers began to look around and notice something frightening. Their world had shrunk to that circle of ice. There was no open horizon, there was no safe rear, only white smoke and the feeling that the ring around them was getting tighter and tighter. Some were still talking about a quick rescue. Others, in whispers, said another word: buried, because that's what the pocket looked like. Not a defensive position, but a huge pit, dug in the snow, waiting to be closed over them. Hunger, cold, and disease. At the start of the siege, there were still supplies. Not much, but enough to give hope. Stale bread, canned goods, dry rations. But almost 100,000 men eat like an army, and a fenced pocket doesn't replenish itself. The portions began to shrink. One slice of bread a day, a little thin soup when there was any. Horse meat, tough, dark, frozen like a rock, has become a luxury. Horses pulling artillery and carts were slaughtered when they could no longer stand. The meat was chopped with an axe and distributed almost raw. Some men ate it while it was still, half frozen, chewing it as if it were leather. Hunger changes a man. Soldiers who were once disciplined now stared at scraps of food on the ground. Fights broke out over an extra morsel. Eyes sank into faces. Uniforms grew loose. Strength vanished. And the cold made everything worse. Starving bodies don't produce enough heat. Men trembled incessantly, even inside makeshift shelters. Sleep became a mortal risk. Many woke up with numb feet, then black. Gangrene began. Doctors had sores, but not enough anesthesia. Screams echoed in the barns, transformed into medical posts. Then came the illness. Without enough clean water, with men crammed into damp, filthy shelters, dysentery spread. Weak soldiers spent days dehydrating, lying in their own filth, unable to get up. Typhus also appeared, high fever, delirium, freezing sweat on the forehead. Already, weak bodies simply gave up. And all this without major battles. Men died staring at the ice-covered wooden ceiling. They died holding unfinished letters. They died silently during the night, while their companion beside them still breathed. In the morning, the ritual was the same. Bodies were carried out, stiff, too light. Often there was no way to bury them deep. The snow did the job. In a few minutes, all that remained was a white mound on the ground. The pocket wasn't being destroyed solely by Soviet bullets. He was being consumed from the inside because of the hunger that gnawed at him, because of the paralyzing cold, and by diseases that progressed invisibly. Men began to realize a terrible truth. Even if the enemy didn't attack anymore, they were still dying too quickly. And the worst part, there were still orders to continue fighting. Hitler forbids retreat, while men froze and died in the makeshift trenches of Demyansk, where the wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at exposed flesh, and ice seeped into bones like an inescapable curse. Far away, in rooms warmed by crackling fireplaces and lit by electric lamps that flickered faintly under the weight of the distant war, German generals leaned over maps spread across polished oak tables. These maps, traced with red and blue lines that resembled the pulsating veins of a dying body, told a story of despair that no officer dared to utter aloud. Reports arrived in piles of crumpled papers, stained with mud and dried blood, sent by exhausted messengers who could barely stand after crossing frozen forests infested with Soviet partisans. Each report was a silent cry. Surrounded on all sides like rats in an iron trap, meager supplies, reduced to crumbs of moldy bread and cartridges counted one by one. Exhausted men, their eyes glazed with cold and hunger, bodies trembling not only from the merciless winter, but from the terror of knowing that death lurked in every snowy shadow. The military solution for any general with a modicum of sanity forged in the Prussian academies of yesteryear seemed as obvious as the sun barely rising on the grey horizon. Break the encirclement while a shred of strength remained in the numb muscles. Retreat to shorter, more defensible lines. Save what was left of those once proud regiments, now reduced to walking ghosts, wrapped in rags that smelled of rot and despair. Retreating was not cowardice, it was survival, an ancient tactic that had saved armies since the time of Hannibal crossing the Alps, or Napoleon fleeing the Russian snows a century earlier. But the war in the east, that endless vastness of dark forests and frozen steppes that swallowed entire divisions like a voracious abyss, was no longer just a matter of coldly calculated tactics and strategies. She had become political, imbued with the fanatical ideology of the Reich, where conquered land was seen as a sacred trophy bathed in the blood of pure Aryans. It was ideological because ceding ground meant questioning the infallibility of the Führer, that man who saw himself as the predestined savior of Germany, guided by a divine providence he himself had invented in nights of delirium. And above all, it was personal. For Adolf Hitler, every kilometer lost was a wound to his colossal ego, an admission that his vision of an invincible blitzkrieg, which had swept across Europe in months, was dissolving in the eternal snows of Russia like an ice castle in the sun. The request for withdrawal, written with trembling hands by field commanders who had seen their soldiers fall like bowling pins under Soviet fire, rose through the chain of command like a desperate prayer cast to the wind. It passed through makeshift headquarters in devastated villages where the smell of smoke and decay hung in the air, until it reached the underground bunkers of Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Den in Rastenburg, where Hitler, in his impeccable uniform and eyes bloodshot with contained fury, devoured reports with the voracity of a predator. The answer came harshly, briefly, definitively, like a verdict from a relentless judge. Hold positions, no retreat. Final victory depends on unwavering tenacity. For him, yielding ground was weakness, a betrayal of the essence of Nazism, which preached racial superiority and the iron will over fragile matter. Every piece of conquered land had been paid for with rivers of German blood, and abandoning it meant admitting that the advance to the east, that crusade against Bolshevism, which he had painted as the final battle between light and darkness, had gone too far, stretched the supply lines to the breaking point, leaving armies isolated like islands in a hostile sea of snow and enemies. On paper, it seemed simple, an order scribbled on telegrams buzzing along the precarious telegraph lines, but in the field, it was a death sentence, a decree sealing the fate of thousands in a white hell where the thermometer plunged beyond 40 degrees Celsius and the human body became a living ice sculpture. The order spread through the pocket like an icy wind penetrating souls, carrying with it the whisper of condemnation. Officers, their faces immobile from the cold and the overwhelming responsibility, read the message in hushed voices to their subordinates, gathered in shelters dug into the snow where the air was thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and fear. Soldiers listened, and for an eternal moment no one spoke, the silence broken only by the distant crackle of gunfire or the groan of a dying, wounded man. Many already knew they were surrounded. They felt it in their bones. They saw it in the Soviet patrols that approached like specters in the fog. But now they knew something worse, something that transformed fear into abyssal terror. They wouldn't get out on their own. There would be no heroic march back, no escape plan under the cover of night. They would have to endure there, rooted in the frozen earth like stakes on a scaffold, with no guarantee of rescue, without knowing when or if the siege would be broken by external forces that seemed as distant as the cold stars in the night sky. Frustration began to simmer beneath the iron discipline, like a pressure cooker about to explode in the ice. Some sergeants, hardened veterans of the campaigns in Poland and France, murmured through clenched teeth, "He's not here. He doesn't feel the cold that devours us. He doesn't see the bodies piled up like firewood." Others, younger and still imbued with the fervor of propaganda, simply stared at the white, infinite and merciless horizon, tightening their tattered coats against their thin bodies, feeling the weight of obedience like invisible chains. But the German army, forged in the Prussian tradition of blind obedience, was trained to obey, even when the order smelled of suicidal madness. And they obeyed, with a stoicism bordering on masochism, reinforcing positions with barriers of compacted snow and frozen logs, rationing their meager supplies even further. A slice of bread a day, a sip of meltwater contaminated by corpses, preparing for a long defense that stretched like an endless nightmare. The problem was that the pocket wasn't a stone fortress, impregnable like the walls of a medieval citadel. It was a fragile circle in the snow, a ring of shallow trenches and makeshift bunkers, surrounded by an enemy that grew like a red tide, reinforced by Siberian divisions accustomed to the cold, armed with machine guns that spat fire and T-34 tanks that roared like primordial beasts. Every man there understood, even if no one dared say. It allowed, for fear of being shot for defeatism, that their war had irrevocably changed. They were no longer fighting to win a grand offensive, to conquer Moscow and crush communism in a glittering victory. They were fighting to hold out until something impossible happened, a miracle that defied the laws of logistics and nature. And, in that winter of 1942, the impossible seemed very distant, buried under layers of snow that indiscriminately buried hopes and bodies. The air was thick with despair, a despair that seeped into dreams, where soldiers saw their distant families, warmed in German homes, while they awoke with fingers blackened by gangrene, lungs burning from the icy air, and the terror of a slow death, forgotten in a remote corner of Russia. But amidst this suffocating darkness, a new idea was emerging in the German high command, whispered in secret meetings where cigarette smoke hung like a fog of doubt. A risky gamble, never attempted on such a large scale. A daring move, bordering on insanity. If they couldn't escape through the blocked and treacherous land, perhaps the vast and unpredictable sky could enter, bringing salvation on wings of metal. The first great airlift in history. If the Earth was lost, swallowed by a sea of snow and enemies multiplying like shadows in the polar night, there remained the sky, that vast blue-gray void that hovered above like an indifferent judge. The idea seemed almost madness, a delirium born of absolute hopelessness, to supply almost 100,000 surrounded men, 95,000 souls, to be precise, of the German II Army Corps, including divisions such as the 12th, 30th and 32nd Infantry, as well as SS and auxiliary units, only by plane, in the dead of the Russian winter of 1942, where temperatures plummeted to 45 degrees Celsius, freezing fuel in tanks and turning metal into fragile glass. Under incessant enemy fire, with Soviet anti-aircraft guns spitting lead into the air and Yak-1 fighters patrolling like hungry falcons. But there was no other choice, for the siege had closed in February, isolating the pocket in an area of about 300 square kilometers, a white prison where hunger gnawed at stomachs and cold devoured extremities. And Hitler, in his heated bunker, approved the plan with a nod, seeing in it not a desperate measure, but proof of German technological superiority, an airlift that would defy the elements and the Bolsheviks. Soon the sky above Demyansk began to rumble, with a sound that echoed like distant thunder, a mechanical roar that cut through the oppressive silence of the snow. Junkers Ju-52 transport planes, those old Luftwaffe workhorses, slow and heavy as winged elephants, with their corrugated fuselages and 3 engines humming in unison, appeared as grey shadows among the low, ice-laden clouds. They flew low, a mere 100 meters above the ground, to avoid the strong winds that could tear their wings and the ice that accumulated like a deadly crust. But this placed them directly within range of Soviet weapons, truck-mounted DSHK machine guns that fired furious bursts, turning the air into a web of red tracers. Inside the pocket, the soldiers heard that sound as if it were celestial music, a hymn to survival in the midst of hell. Engines, life arriving from above, a promise that they had not been completely abandoned to the mercy of cruel fate. Makeshift runways were urgently carved into the snow with feverish fervor, uneven, poorly leveled. Lines dug by rusty shovels and frozen hands, marked by tattered red flags and men signaling through the biting wind that whipped their faces like blades. These weren't real airfields with control towers and paved runways. They were frozen clearings in felled forests where furrows of ice concealed deadly traps. And any mistake, a crosswind, a locked wheel, meant catastrophe. The plane tumbling in a fireball that illuminated the snow with a hellish orange glow, scattering wreckage and charred bodies. The landings were brutal, rituals of terror where pilots, their faces pale beneath their leather helmets, struggled with the controls as the wheels battered irregularities, sliding on patches of ice that made the WW2 dance like a drunkard on a deadly skating rink. Men rushed to unload, in a frantic choreography of desperation. Sacks of stale bread, boxes of 7.92-meter ammunition for the MG-34s, medicines like morphine for the groans of the wounded, fuel in drums that leaked in the cold, all done in counted minutes because time was an enemy as implacable as the Soviets, because the Soviets were listening too, their ears sharpened by a thirst for revenge after years of brutal invasion. Heavy artillery, like 152-meter howitzers, began to fall near the runways, exploding in geysers of snow and frozen earth that rained down lethal shrapnel. Machine guns fired from the dense forests, tracer bullets zigzagging like fiery serpents, piercing fuselages and claiming lives. Sometimes a plane would be hit while still on the ground, exploding in an orange conflagration that devoured everything around it. The smell of burnt kerosene mixing with that of charred flesh, leaving stunned survivors crawling away, their ears ringing and terror etched in their eyes. When conditions prevented landing, snowstorms that reduced visibility to zero or intense enemy fire, they would drop cargo by parachute, heavy boxes descending and swinging like erratic pendulums, some falling on Soviet territory to the delight of the enemy, others shattering on impact with the frozen ground, scattering precious contents like useless confetti in the snow. Even so, it worked, at least at the beginning, a Pyrrhic victory against overwhelming odds. Bread reappeared in rations, still frozen as stones, but chewable enough to stave off the hunger gnawing at the insides. Ammunition kept the guns ready, allowing the defenders to repel Soviet attacks that came in waves. Red soldiers advancing, shouting, "Hooray!" over the blood-stained snow. Seriously wounded were put aboard for evacuation, men wrapped in dirty blankets, eyes sunken like wells of despair, some already missing feet or hands amputated by gangrene, groaning in agony as the plane took off, swaying in the turbulent air. But each flight was a mortal risk, a game of Russian roulette with the sky as a merciless croupier. Storms arose without warning, black clouds swallowing entire squadrons, ice forming on the wings like a deadly armor that dragged the planes to the abyss. Planes disappeared into the clouds and were never seen again, leaving behind only broken radio echoes and families in Germany waiting for letters that would never arrive. Crews that crashed behind the lines rarely survived, captured by partisans, tortured in hidden huts, or simply frozen in the snow, their bodies discovered in the spring like macabre relics. The sky, like the earth, had become a battlefield, a theater of horrors where pilots, 20-year-olds, with dreams of glory, faced the terror of night flights over hostile territory with primitive instruments and inaccurate maps. Still, for the men on the ground, each plane that appeared on the cloudy horizon meant another day alive, a sliver of hope amidst the despair that consumed them. They began to look up as if praying to capricious gods, hands clasped in silent prayer, hearts beating to the rhythm of the engines. The pocket was still a prison, with invisible walls of snow and enemy fire, but now there was a fragile line connecting that prison to the world outside, a line woven from spinning propellers, scarce fuel, and courage forged in the fires of hell. A strategy that, ironically, fueled not only those surrounded, but also a dangerous illusion in the upper echelons. No one there knew that this logistical victory, which transported some 65,000 tons of supplies in over 30,000 flights, with the loss of hundreds of planes and lives, would give Hitler a dangerous confidence and illusion that sieges could be sustained indefinitely by air, a fallacy that, months later, would cost an entire army in the cauldron of Stalingrad, where the same plan would fail miserably, leaving 91,000 prisoners and 250,000 dead. But in Demyansk, for the time being, the sky was the only thing between them and certain death, a thin veil against the abyss of terror, despair, and annihilation that surrounded them, whispering promises of salvation while winter dragged on like an eternity of suffering. The sky also becomes a battlefield. Initially, the supply flights caught the Soviets by surprise, like a magic trick amidst the white chaos of the Eastern Front, where the Red Army, still recovering from the colossal losses of the initial German invasion in 1941, did not expect the Nazis to defy the merciless skies with such audacity. Those first Ju-52s, affectionately nicknamed Tante Ju by the German pilots, glided almost unnoticed over the Soviet lines, their grey silhouettes blending into the snow-laden clouds, delivering vital cargo that seemed like miracles falling from above. Packages of canned meat, ammunition cartridges for the Karabiner 98K, and even letters from home that brought a fleeting glimpse of normality amidst the nightmare. But this was short-lived, a mere sigh in the hurricane of war, for the Soviets, forged in the brutal resilience of a nation that had already endured Mongol, Napoleonic, and now this invasion, learned quickly, adapting like predators in their natural habitat. Soviet observers, camouflaged in hastily dug snow shelters on the edges of the pocket, began marking times, routes, and altitudes with the precision of patient hunters, using frozen binoculars and wristwatches that barely functioned in the biting cold. These men, often local partisans or reconnaissance soldiers from the Siberian divisions, hardened by winters that made Demyansk seem mild, noted everything in soaked notebooks, sending reports by crackling radio, to commanders like General Pavel Korochkin of the Northwestern Front, who saw a German vulnerability in the sky to be exploited. Soon, anti-aircraft guns, such as the dreaded 37mm M1939, were being dragged through the deep snow by teams of exhausted horses or soldiers pulling with crude ropes, positioned among ancient trees of the Valdai forests, camouflaged with white branches and fake snow nets that made them invisible until the fatal moment. These cannons, operated by gunners with their faces bandaged against the wind, lay like living traps, ready to turn the air into a slaughterhouse. And then the sky began to explode, a spectacle of horror that transformed the vast blue-gray canopy into a labyrinth of death, where each flight became a game of Russian roulette with human lives at stake. When the Ju-52s appeared, slow and heavy as overloaded barges in the air, black trails of smoke rose from the dense forest, tracer projectiles tearing through the icy air with a sharp hiss that echoed like the scream of condemned souls. Shrapnel cut through corrugated metal fuselages, piercing cockpits where pilots and navigators, 20-year-olds with families far away in Berlin or Munich, gripped the controls with gloved hands, feeling the plane tremble like a mortally wounded living being. Engines failed with a mechanical cough, black oil leaking like blood, and the planes began to lose altitude in slow spirals, leaving trails of smoke that painted the immaculate sky like eternal. Scars. Some still managed to land miraculously on makeshift runways that looked more like traps than salvation. leaving trails of dark oil on the virgin snow, where ground crews rushed to unload in terror of imminent explosions. Others lost altitude slowly, like leaves falling in a hellish autumn, until they disappeared behind the ancient trees, followed by seconds of suffocating tension, and then a muffled explosion that reverberated through the snowy hills, sending columns of fire and snow into the air, and then an oppressive silence, broken only by the howling wind that seemed to mourn the dead. Soviet fighters also joined the hunt, aircraft like the Lavochkin LA-5 or the Yakovlev Yak-1, piloted by aces like Ivan Kozhedub, who would later become a hero of the Soviet Union, emerging from the pale winter sun like predatory falcons, swooping down on the almost defenseless transports with murderous speed. 7.62mm Shkas machine guns sliced through fragile wings, plexiglass cockpits shattered in a hail of fragments, fuel tanks exploded in fireballs that illuminated the grey day like artificial suns of destruction. Crews inside the planes know they can't maneuver like agile fighters. The WW2s were cargo planes, not fighters, designed for efficiency, not dogfights, so they can only move forward in predictable straight lines, hoping that fate or a gust of wind will spare them, praying in whispers as panic settles in wide eyes. Many flights never arrive, disappearing into the hostile skies, leaving behind only broken radio echoes and families in Germany receiving cold telegrams, missing in action. Inside the pocket, soldiers look to the sky for supplies, with a mixture of fragile hope and growing terror, and sometimes see only a burning point slowly falling, like a cursed shooting star, leaving a trail of black smoke against the infinite white of the landscape, a visual reminder that salvation was illusory and death reigned supreme. When a plane crashes within German territory, men rush to the wreckage in a desperate race against time and fire, digging through twisted metal and melting snow, sometimes finding boxes of supplies scattered like treasures in a shipwreck, cans of life-saving soup, rolls of bandages for the wounded groaning in agony. Other times, they find only charred bodies still strapped to their seats, unrecognizable faces beneath layers of soot and melted flesh, empty eyes staring into the void, a spectacle that instills visceral terror, making soldiers vomit in the snow or fall to their knees in silent despair. And when they fall outside the pocket, beyond the German lines, the crew faces the same fate as those surrounded, only alone, wounded, in the middle of enemy territory and the murderous cold that freezes open wounds, turning blood into red crystals. Captured by Soviet patrols, they faced brutal interrogations in freezing huts, or worse, were left to die of hypothermia, their bodies discovered in the spring as macabre relics of a merciless war. The airlift continues, but now it has a visible price, a cost in souls that weighed heavily on every Luftwaffe commander, like Hermann Göring, who had promised the Führer that the air could sustain any siege, a promise that proved to be a bloody lie. Each bag of bread delivered could mean a lost crew, shattered families in German villages. Each box of ammunition could cost an airplane, an investment of metal and engineering reduced to ashes. Even so, the flights do not stop, driven by absolute necessity, for without them, the pocket would die in days, starving and without ammunition, succumbing to the icy embrace of defeat. Then, the sky over Demyansk becomes a corridor of death. Planes entering laden with tenuous hope, propellers spinning like mechanical prayers, and many not returning, leaving voids in the air and holes in the souls of those who watched from below. Down below, the soldiers learn to tell time in a new way, no longer by the days that dragged on in a white eternity, marked by frozen clocks or suns that barely warmed them, but by the engines that still managed to traverse the icy hell above them, each distant roar a pulse of life in a collective, agonizing body. Terror settled in like a fog, mingling with the despair of knowing that their survival depended on men flying to their deaths, and the fear that one day the sky would be empty forever, leaving them at the mercy of the void and the enemy. And meanwhile, on the Ground. The Red Army prepares to crush the pocket once and for all, gathering forces like a storm forming on the horizon, ready to unleash its fury. 10. Soviet attacks, wave after wave. With the encirclement closing in February 1942, isolating some 95,000 German soldiers within a perimeter of approximately 90 kilometers, and the airlift functioning as a fragile thread of life amidst the chaos, the Soviets knew they could not simply wait, allowing the Nazi invaders, those who had burned villages and massacred civilians in their merciless march, to reorganize in their frozen positions. If they allowed the Germans to breathe, to recover their strength with air supplies, the pocket could become an impregnable fortress, prolonging a war that had already cost millions of Soviet lives since Operation Barbarossa. So they decided to crush the pocket by force under orders from the Stavka, the Soviet high command led by Stalin, who saw in Demyansk an opportunity to demonstrate the resilience of the Russian people and turn the tide of the invasion. And the assaults began not as a single gigantic attack that could be repelled in an epic battle, but as incessant waves of violence, repeated blows in different sectors of the perimeter, days and nights blending into a blur of continuous terror, like constant hammer blows trying to crack a stone hardened by ice and German determination. Soviet artillery cleared the way with a bombardment that transformed the land into a seismic inferno. Cannons like the 122 2mm WM 1938 and heavy mortars spitting projectiles that fell on already fragile German positions. Shallow trenches dug in compacted snow that offered little protection. Explosions sent snow and frozen earth flying in white geysers mingling with debris, hurling chunks of shattered tree trunks, razor-sharp blocks of ice, and dismembered bodies into the air. The sound echoing through the dense forests like thunder trapped between ancient trees, reverberating in the bones of the defenders and instilling a primal dread that made men cower like children. Then came the infantry, hordes of Soviet soldiers advancing in coordinated groups, using fresh craters and fallen tree trunks as makeshift shelter, their white camouflage uniforms blending into the snow so seamlessly that they looked like ghosts emerging from the eternal white. Sometimes the Germans only noticed them when they were just a few meters away, their faces red from the cold and fury, their eyes gleaming with the accumulated hatred of a violated nation, shouting "Ura!" in unison as they charged with Mosin Nagant rifles and PPSH-41 submachine guns. The combat became something primitive, a return to ancestral barbarity, where technology gave way to the instinct for survival. Grenades exploding in shallow trenches, sending limbs flying and filling the air with the acrid smell of TNT and torn flesh. Bayonets fixed to rifles, piercing thick coats and penetrating viscera in hand-to-hand combat on the slippery ice, where warm blood melted the snow before freezing into scarlet-red pools. Men fell and did not rise, bodies writhing in final agony before stiffening in the cold, faces frozen in masks of eternal terror, mouths open in silent screams. Others slipped on the blood that stained the snow dark red, transforming the field into a deadly skating rink, where each step was a gamble against death. German machine guns, like the MG-42 with its infernal rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute, spewed fire until they overheated, barrels smoking in the frozen air like red-hot iron, gunners firing shot after shot, even with hands almost without feeling, fingers blackened by frost and constant recoil, eyes watering from the effort and the dread that the ammunition would run out before the enemy. But each defense came at a high price, a cost in lives that drained the pocket like a slow hemorrhage. For every repelled attack, there were dead bodies piled up in front of the positions like grotesque barricades, the ground between the lines turning into a field of frozen bodies in attack poses. Some still with outstretched hands, as if trying to reach the trench in a final gesture of revenge, faces preserved by the ice in expressions of anger or despair. At night, the attacks didn't stop, transforming the darkness into a living nightmare where sleep was a forgotten luxury. Soviet flares illuminated the bluish darkness with a spectral glow, casting dancing shadows among trees that seemed like living monsters. Shadows raced between the trunks. Shots came from all sides like lethal whispers. Soldiers awoke under sudden explosions, grabbing weapons with numb fingers, not knowing if the enemy was 20 meters away or 2, their hearts racing with the terror of an invisible bayonet in the dark. The wear and tear was brutal, an exhaustion that corroded mind and body. There was no true rest, even on calm days. A relative concept in Demyansk, sporadic artillery fire reminded them that the Soviet iron ring was there, always there, tightening like an invisible claw, instilling a despair that made men question their sanity in nocturnal whispers. The Germans still held on, with a tenacity born of Nazi indoctrination and the fear of surrender, for they knew the Soviets were unforgiving, treating prisoners with the same brutality the Nazis inflicted. But they were shrinking, the pocket contracting like a wounded organism, losing ground meter by meter. Each Soviet attack bit away at the perimeter. Each defense left fewer men for the next wave, with wounded men groaning in makeshift underground shelters where the smell of gangrene and excrement mingled with gunpowder. The White Inferno now had sound, smell, and color. The roar of explosions that shook the earth like earthquakes, the smell of acrid gunpowder and burnt flesh that permeated nostrils and dreams, and the dark red spreading across the snow like a plague, staining the pure white with the blood of thousands. And this was not yet the worst moment of the siege, for time was passing, inexorably like the thaw of the approaching spring, and the pocket was bleeding faster than the sky could heal, with air supplies dwindling under anti-aircraft fire, and despair growing like a shadow that swallowed hopes, leaving only the terror of imminent annihilation, where each soldier saw himself as a disposable piece in a game of cruel gods. The snow covers the dead. After weeks of attacks, the terrain around the German positions no longer resembled a natural landscape. It was a death camp that winter tried to conceal. Bodies were everywhere, among the trees, in craters, leaning against trunks as if they were still sitting to rest. Soviet and German soldiers mixed together, sometimes just a few meters from each other, frozen in their last fighting positions. The snow fell on them indiscriminately. First, he covered his boots, then the arms, then the faces. Before long, all that remained was a white mound, and sometimes a stiff hand pointing to the sky, or the tip of a helmet emerging from the surface like a stone in a frozen sea. The living had to live with it. Trenches were dug alongside frozen bodies that could not be retrieved. In some places, they served as makeshift cover. War left no time for ceremonies. The smell, when the weather warmed up a bit during the day, was heavy, sweet and rotten at the same time. Then it would freeze again. Many soldiers stopped reacting. At first, each death was shocking. Then it became part of the scenery. The gaze would pass over a frozen face as if seeing a fallen tree trunk. It was the only way to go on. At night, under the pale moonlight reflected on the snow, the field seemed full of figures lying down, silent, motionless, watching. Patrols that went out heard the sound of their own boots crunching on the ice, and nothing more. No birds, no strong wind, only the presence of those who stayed behind. The snow did what war couldn't. It erased names, faces, stories. Men who once had families, letters in their pockets, folded photographs, were now just shapes beneath the white background. And with each new attack, more joined them. The soldiers inside the pocket began to understand something that wasn't on the maps. Demyansk was not just a surrounded position. It was becoming a giant tomb, where winter played the role of gravedigger. Morale is collapsing. At the beginning of the siege, there was still something that kept the men going, the idea that it was temporary, that soon the siege would be broken, that they would be able to move again, that this was just another phase of the war. But the weeks turned into months, and their world remained the same size. Snow, trees, smoke, explosions. The exhaustion ceased to be physical and became something deeper, Soldiers sat in the trenches, staring blankly into space, unresponsive to the sounds around them. Some had to be shaken to respond to simple orders. Letters were written by the dim light of candles, hands trembling not only from cold, but from exhaustion. "If I don't come back, tell our son that." Many wrote as if they were already saying goodbye to life. Some kept the letters in their pockets with nowhere to send them. Fear also changed. It was no longer the panic of a sudden attack. It was a constant, heavy fear that never left my chest. The fear of falling asleep and not waking up, of getting sick, of the next explosion happening right there. Some men began to break down from the inside. There were those who stopped talking, those who laughed at the wrong times, those who shivered even when it wasn't that cold. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but even they were at their limit. They looked at their men and saw faces older than months ago, sunken eyes, grown beards, gazes that seemed to have already taken them far away. The word home began to sound unreal. The war, which previously had a front and a rear, was now just a closed circle where each day was the same as the previous one. Even the arriving planes no longer brought much hope. They were just another day of survival, not a way out. And the question that no one wanted to ask began to surface in their minds. What if nobody comes? The pocket was still holding out militarily. The lines were still standing, but inside many men were already broken. And when morale falls, even the strongest weapon feels like lead. But outside the siege, something was finally moving, a desperate attempt to fight a way through to them, and that meant another bloody phase. The corridor of salvation. Outside the encirclement, the German command knew the situation couldn't last forever. The airlift kept the men alive, but it didn't win the war. The siege needed to be broken by land. So, in the spring of 1942, the relief operation began. German units attacked from the outside towards Demyansk, trying to force a corridor to the encirclement, but the terrain was as formidable. An enemy as the Soviets. Winter was beginning to recede, and that wasn't good news. The snow melted, revealing the region's true face. Swamps, deep mud, roads turning into rivers of filth where trucks got stuck up to their axles. Men waded through icy water up to their knees, pulling cannons with ropes, slipping, falling. And the Soviets knew exactly what was at stake. They defended every meter with everything they had. Machine guns hidden among the trees, artillery covering narrow trails, minefields beneath the mud. Every German advance was paid for in blood. Explosions shook the forest. Trees split in two. The air smelled of gunpowder, wet earth, and death. The soldiers outside were fighting not only to advance, but to reach their own trapped comrades. Many had friends, brothers in arms, and well-known officers inside the pocket. It was a race against time. Inside Demiansk, those trapped inside began to hear something different. Artillery fire coming from a new direction. Closer. Intense fighting on the edge of the pocket. Rumors ran through the trenches. They are coming. They are trying to clear a path. But it was still just a distant hope. Between them and freedom lay miles of forest filled with Soviets determined to prevent any contact. The attacks from inside and outside attempted to coordinate. Surrounded units launched local offensives to pressure the ring from the inside, while external forces pushed from the outside. The result was a violent crushing at the point of contact. Fighting took place at such close range that grenades exploded among trees just meters away on either side. Screams, gunfire, mud flying, men falling and being trampled. The corridor of salvation did not yet exist. It was being forcibly dug out, with steel blades, with artillery fire, and with bodies. But for the first time in months, something had changed. Hope no longer came solely from heaven. She was crawling through the mud, making its way centimeter by centimeter, towards the white hell of Demiansk, the escape through death row, April 1942. After weeks of brutal fighting, the German effort from the outside and the pressure from those surrounded on the inside finally meet. A land link is opened. It's not a wide road. It's not a safe route. It is a narrow, uneven corridor, constantly under Soviet fire, an open wound in the ring of encirclement. But for the men of Demyansk, that is life. The news spreads through the posts like electricity. There is a way out, but leaving isn't easy. The thaw has turned the ground into deep mud. Trucks get stuck, carts break down. The wounded are placed on makeshift stretchers, carried by men who can barely stand. And the Soviets relentlessly attack the corridor. Artillery rains down on the route. Machine guns sweep open sections. Soviet planes bomb columns attempting to pass. At any moment, the path could be closed again. The first to leave are the seriously wounded, the sick, those who can no longer fight. Many are left lying down, staring at the grey sky without the strength even to speak. Then come exhausted units marching in silence. Torn uniforms, sunken faces, empty eyes. They look like ghosts emerging from the snow. Bodies are left along the way. Some die before reaching safety. Others are struck by shrapnel in the final stretch. The corridor acquires a whispered name among the men, Death Row. But even so, they keep passing by. Each step out of the pocket is a step away from the white tomb that held them captive for months. Behind them lie the destroyed positions, the shelters carved into the ice, and thousands who will not return. When they finally reach safety, many simply collapse to the ground. They don't celebrate. They don't shout. They just breathe as if they were relearning how to live. They survived, but they didn't come out whole. And what happened in Demyansk would not be forgotten, neither by those who fought there, nor by those who watched from afar and drew the wrong conclusions. Because for some leaders, it looked like a victory. For the men who were there, it was simply escaping a hell that almost swallowed them up forever. Demyansk's deadly lesson. When the siege finally ended and the survivors left Demyansk, what remained was a killing field covered in melting snow. Thousands dead, thousands were mutilated, men who would never be the same again. But in the command reports, something else stood out. The pocket had held. The air bridge worked. The fences were not destroyed. For many officers, this was seen as proof that a modern army could survive being surrounded, provided it was supplied by air and held out long enough. And Adolf Hitler believed it wholeheartedly. He saw Demyansk not as a warning, but as a role model. He ignored the human cost. He ignored the fact that the pocket was smaller, that the Luftwaffe still had strength, that the climate and terrain had specific conditions. Look at the result. Men surrounded who did not surrender. Months later, when the German Sixth Army would be surrounded in Stalingrad, the memory of Demyansk would return. Generals would request a swift withdrawal. They would warn about a lack of supplies, about winter, regarding the enemy closing in. And Hitler would say confidently, the airlift will work, just like in Demyansk. But Stalingrad was not Demyansk. There, the scale was larger, the distances greater, the enemy stronger, the Luftwaffe weaker. What was a mere struggle for survival in Demyansk turned into a deadly illusion in Stalingrad. Thus, the snow of Demyansk did not bury only men. She buried the chance to learn the right lesson. For the soldiers who fought there, the truth was simple and harsh. They did not overcome the winter. They did not win the siege. They only survived long enough to get out, leaving behind a part of themselves, frozen in that white hell forever. And this is the true mark of Demyansk, a battle where nature killed, man massacred, and the misinterpretation would cost tens of thousands of lives later. Demyansk is not remembered for the great tank battles, nor for the ruined cities that became a symbol of war. But for the men who were there, that place was something even worse. It was a field where war had lost any illusion of glory. There, the enemy wasn't just the soldier on the other side of the crosshairs. It was the cold that stopped the heart, hunger that extinguished strength, the disease that took men without ever firing a single shot. The Demyansk Pocket proved that an army could withstand being surrounded, but it also showed the brutal price of that. Each day of survival was bought with lost fingers, amputated limbs, bodies buried by the snow without names or crosses. Those who survived did not return as heroes. They returned as survivors of something that should never have been possible, and in the icy silence that followed, the battle left a dangerous echo, a false lesson, a misplaced confidence, the idea that heaven would always save those who were confined. But the snow of Demyansk had already given its warning. She showed that on the Eastern Front, nature could be as lethal as any army, that the war there wasn't just men against men, it was men against the world. Beneath that white layer lay not only the dead, but it's a reminder that resisting doesn't always mean winning. Sometimes it's just about surviving a hell that no one should have to go through.